Chapter 6. This chapter is called An Inadequate Judaism. As we have said, one of the greatest conundrums of the Holocaust is that the segment of world Jewry that suffered most greatly was equally the most religious. It was Polish Jews who suffered the greatest devastation of the Holocaust. They were virtually wiped out, community after community. The vast majority of them were Orthodox or even ultra-Orthodox. How then could God be the author of the Holocaust when it was the most religious Jews who were exterminated in great numbers and the secular Jews, to a certain extent, who were spared? Why were the predominantly secular American Jews spared? Where's the justice in that? And where was God, who should have more evidently honored the pious and preserved them? By this logic, we could almost think that his justice and righteousness would have been more effectually demonstrated by devastating the secular rather than devastating the religious. Merely because we are impressed by religious orthodoxy and look upon it as the highest and most authentic expression of Judaism does not mean that God is necessarily impressed. In fact, what impresses us may likely be most grievous to him. It might be that they were more the victims of judgment because what was celebrated in their religion was not the knowledge of God in truth, but what men in their tradition had celebrated as dear to themselves. Did we have a vision and a view of God that, though it served our purposes, did not necessarily serve his? The fact that we are a religious people, in quotation marks, does not guarantee that we have the knowledge of God in truth. Judaism as a religion is remarkably ignorant of the judgments that we have suffered in the past for the rejection of God's word. Even Talmudic or rabbinical Judaism does not center in the scriptures so much as in the commentaries of men. The Talmudic literature often expresses a spirit in which God is, in fact, argued with and corrected and put in his place by the great rabbinical sages. Then the Holocaust comes, and the ones who were wiped out in massive numbers were not the secular Jews of the Western world, but the Orthodox Jews of Poland, who were steeped in this Talmudic literature. If indeed their orthodoxy is reflected of this Talmudic disputation with God, should we not wonder that they were the main recipients of his chastisements? The true knowledge of God is vital to all aspects of life. If men go on for centuries willfully or ignorantly in a false, inadequate knowledge of God, having in fact rejected the most profound and acute revelations of God given to us, what can the end of that be? Could it be that we were offered that revelation of God as he in fact is in the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah of Israel? Though we saw it 2,000 years ago, God has allowed a set of inevitable circumstances to issue from that, namely, the collapse and fall of our nation, our diasporic dispersal into the nations, the loss of the hereditary Aaronic Kohanim priesthood, and the end of substitutionary sacrifice with the destruction of the temple, and therefore no biblically sanctioned covering or atonement for the sin of the nation. Alienated from his temple, we have gone through 2,000 years without a biblically valid atonement, and there is a cumulative sin that is neither covered nor dismissed, for without the shedding of blood there is no atonement. Leviticus 17:11. A council of rabbis can decree an alternative through good deeds, prayer, and fasting, and call that the Yom Kippur, the Day of Covering or Atonement. But is it valid in God's sight? Or is it not much more than an alternative promulgated by men that presumes on his acceptance of their innovation? With the destruction of the temple and the dispersal of the priesthood, two of God's judgments on us for our failure to keep covenant, a humanly ordained alternative has developed that is foundational to today's Judaism. But it is rabbinical more than biblical. Has Judaism itself become not much more than a mode of life and a social culture that is entirely separate from any possibility of a true knowledge of God as a vital reality and presence? In its more liberal forms, it is hardly more than an ethical humanism, and to be merely ethicizing will not touch the heart condition of man. The recognition of the destruction of the temple as God's judgment upon us could have laid the groundwork for repentance and return to our God in truth. But instead, by the unquestioned acceptance of rabbinical Judaism as normative, generations of Jews have been robbed of the prospect of the knowledge of God and his salvation, a condition that continues to this day. God must necessarily denounce and remain hidden from any system of religion that rests upon man's obtaining or wresting of knowledge, or from any system created by man that may even employ scriptures in its activity, but which essentially rests in man and in his own initiative. God will never give himself to that which has its origin in man, but he reserves the right in himself to reveal the true knowledge of himself. For even in his best intention, whatever man devises can be nothing but the projection of man himself. How can a piece of creation conceive the God who has created it? Can the lower thing rightly describe the greater? We, as Jews, love to talk about God as an impersonal force, in quotation marks, or a higher power, in quotation marks, in the universe. And we can believe in this God, but in the day of our calamity, we will not get an answer because this is not God as he desires to be known. It is yet a God of our own making, which in effect leaves us without God. If it is man conceiving God, then it is man superior to God. Ultimately, our view of him has been nothing more than a projection of ourselves, and we are all too satisfied with that view. We have made ourselves the standard of what we think God is and ought to be by presuming that he is not much different from ourselves. We need to deeply understand that the true knowledge of God is not readily at man's disposal. God is not amenable to our terms. He is not waiting for man's initiative and thought. He is hidden and reveals himself only on his own terms, at his own will, in a readiness that he himself provides. He does not make himself available on man's terms, but his own, and unless we deeply understand that and subscribe to that, there can be no beginning for the revelation of God. That very one thing is everything. To understand a God who is hidden and to understand that everything is entirely dependent upon him are the very grounds of truth. It means, however, the most humbling and disorienting acknowledgement from men who celebrate themselves and their ability as the basis for knowledge, for life, and for the understanding of anything. The acknowledgement of God as He is, as He in fact is, puts man in his place, striking at the root of the human error of the whole misconception of reality and self. And what we need to consider is the end of that error, because if we continue to function in it, however much it may have served us in our own lifetime and even for generations, the end of it could be another Auschwitz or worse, an irredeemable and eternal hellish separation from God. Why then do men prefer a religious form that is not the knowledge of God in truth over the true knowledge of Him? Why is there in man this instinctive and deep aversion to the knowledge of God and a preference for a religious substitute? It could be said that religion is that human amalgam of practice and thought that gives men the form of something in which they can engage themselves to their own satisfaction, and at the same time shields them from the obligation that the true knowledge of God brings. Why do we not rush to the knowledge of God in truth if it is actually available? Why do we prefer Judaism or Catholicism or Protestantism or even occult alternatives? It is because the true knowledge of God brings requirement. To know God in truth is to know the requirement of God in truth, and that is not convenient for man. This may be one of the most profoundest reasons why we circumvent God and prefer a God of our own choosing who does not make demands. To have a view of God that exempts the judgment of God as being a central facet of God's character and way is to have a warped view of God. To know Him as He in fact is, in both His severity and His goodness, is to know Him in truth. And to know Him as that God is to be saved by Him out of the extremity and calamity of our fallen humanity. To know God as judge is therefore one of the eminent prerequisites for the true knowledge of Him. God is indivisible, and we cannot parcel Him out and enjoy certain of His attributes to the exclusion of others. The consequence of an inadequate faith and an inadequate knowledge of God is tragic beyond all describing, especially to that people chosen to make Him known. What are His mercies but for His judgments? And what are His judgments, rightly understood, but His mercies? To see God in His acts as both the God of judgment and the God of restoration is to begin to catch a glimpse of God in His fullness. This is more than an issue of theology. It is the issue of reality itself. It is for this reason that the Holocaust holds a key to the question of human existence. The whole issue of life has to do with the understanding of the human condition itself. God is beyond our categories. He is other, in quotation marks, and unless we come to that understanding, then everything is necessarily warped and askew. So what if God chooses to reveal Himself in ways beyond man's desire to comprehend? For example, what would you say if God chose to come in the form of a man? Would that contradict every category that we have held dear? Could you conceive of God being born in a stable through a virgin? Impossible, you say. Would God allow himself to be executed as a criminal in the cruelest and most degrading form of public death, nailed nakedly to a piece of wood? For God to suffer this kind of brutality and devastation has got to wreck any kind of notion that we conceivably have of God, particularly our Jewish notions that celebrate the, in quotes, nobility of God. Could God, in Jesus of Nazareth, have defied every concept of what man thinks God is? Could he have, in point of time, put this before our faces and said, in quotes, "This is your God"? If so, in the refusal of that revelation and by insisting upon keeping our own inadequate views, were we not giving reasons for our own future chastisements? And when those chastisements came, did we have a God to whom we could turn, or was he silent? Could we perhaps have rejected God in the form in which he chose to reveal himself? And if so, could that rejection be as much rampant now as then? There are many things that can be said about God, but the deepest things and the ultimately revelatory things about God are found in the willing sacrifice of himself. Consider, if you will, that nothing says more about God as he in fact is than a God crucified by his own creation and people. If so, why? What was he doing and what was he saying? We are suggesting that this is what God is really like in himself, and as he desires for men to know him and be conformed to him. In that sense, then, not to know God as crucified is not to know God. We can call him, in quotation marks, God, but unless he is this God-man, this promised Messiah whom we crucified, then we invariably have a God of our own imagining whom we have labeled, in quotation marks, God, but a God who tragically cannot answer. This is critical, the nexus and the heart of the issue. This is where it all comes together, and to miss it here is to miss it everywhere. In our opinion, Jewish tragedy through the ages is that missing. We miss the day of his visitation, though he pleaded with us and wept over us again and again, and so wanted to take us under his wings as a hen does her chicks, but the historical truth is that we would not hear of it. He warned us that our house would become desolate and our temple destroyed, leaving us without a priesthood and sacrifice. There would be no blood atonement and therefore no covering, kapora, which meant that every brutal demonic thing would have full and free sway to attack us. We failed to see our God as he wanted to be seen and known, and thereby we failed to see man, or the condition of mankind as it really is, as those whose iniquity is ever before them. The one is inextricably bound up with the other, as Isaiah himself witnessed. In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord, seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, "Holy, holy, holy, The Lord of hosts, his presence fills all the earth. The doorposts would shake at the sound of the one who called, and the house kept filling with smoke. I cried, woe is me, I am undone, for I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my own eyes have beheld the King, the Lord of hosts. That's Isaiah 6, 1 through 5. The prophet who sees this sight is devastated by the view of himself, a view that he could not have glimpsed until he saw the Lord as he in fact is, rather than as he thought him to be. The worst deception of all is an erroneous view of God. It could be poetic, religious, benevolent, and aesthetically impressive, eventuating in wonderful works and philanthropies, but it is deception, all the more for those very reasons. How does God finally break us out of our stubborn insistence that our view of God is superior to his own revelation? In the crucifixion of Messiah, Jesus, we were given to see what sin meant for God and what it therefore needs to mean for us. We were given to see what sin meant for God and what it therefore needs to mean for us. But we turned our faces away from him and refused to consider. We have our own view, namely, that man's not all that bad, and even progressively improvable. But human perfectibility outside of God is a totally humanistic view. There is no alternative but to render God a concept, if we have forsaken the costly revelation of God in a crucified Messiah. That revelation, and that alone, saves us from the things which man conceives, which, by definition, must necessarily be less and therefore other than God. End of chapter 6.